All right. Today is February 16th, 2021. I am Daniel Erickson, and today I'm interviewing Dr. Tracy Floreani over Zoom about Oklahoma Humanities and her interactions with the organization. So thank you for joining me today, Tracy. I'm glad that we're able to get this together and conduct this interview.
Congrats on pronouncing my last name correctly.
Oh, yeah?
First try.
Yeah, I'm minoring in Italian.
Oh, perfect.
So yeah, I have practice with Italian last names and pronunciation and stuff. But yeah, so getting started, why don't you just tell me a little bit about yourself?
I'm a professor of English at Oklahoma City University, and I'm also the director of the university's Center for Interpersonal Studies through Film and Literature, which is a public humanities initiative that was started through an endowment by Jeannie Hoffman-Smith, who's been a big humanities philanthropist here in town for many, many years. And so I actually came to Oklahoma in 2010 and was hired at Oklahoma City University as the chair of the English department at that time, and started getting to know Oklahoma Humanities through some collaborations I was involved in as the department chair. And then when I took on the center, I obviously started getting more actively involved in regular programming through their existing programs. So it's been a great organization to work with.
Okay. Before you came to Oklahoma, where'd you live before that?
I lived in Lawrence, Kansas, and for about 17 years off and on. And I went to grad school at University of Kansas and did my master's and PhD there. And then I taught at Baker University, a small liberal arts college, not unlike Oklahoma City University, which is in Baldwin City, Kansas. And I had very little interaction with the state humanities councils there. It was called the Kansas Humanities Council. They weren't as visible, I think, as Oklahoma Humanities, and they had a reputation for being challenging to get funding from and challenging to work with. And so I didn't really understand the possibilities of ways to work with a humanities organization, public humanities organization, until I moved here. Because Oklahoma Humanities they're so open and they have such a great staff. So it was really interesting, eye-opening process to see a different state humanities organization.
Okay. And were the humanities something that always interested you in school growing up?
Absolutely. I was a big reader and a writer as a kid. I thought I wanted to be a writer when I was little. And when I was little and in high school, I toyed with other career aspirations, but I was always very focused on ideas and imaginative writing and language. I was deeply invested in language study and linguistics actually when I was younger as well. So I got kind of into my field sort of through language and comparative literature. And then took classes in American Studies as an undergrad, and that really sparked something. I got really interested in American culture and the paradoxes built into American culture. And so I ended up specializing in that. But I was always interested in some aspect or another of how culture functions, and how culture affects individuals and how individuals influence cultures. So those are questions that have always really interested me. But I did work in a bakery to put myself through college. I have other interests.
Yeah. Don't we all?
I was a straight through person though. I went straight to college from high school, and then I tried to go straight to graduate school, but that didn't work out. So I took a year off to just work in the food industry, and then went to grad school and just plowed straight through. So it's been a pretty straight trajectory in terms of my academic career.
Okay. Where'd you go to undergrad?
University of Texas at Austin.
Okay.
Yeah, and I had some pretty formative experiences there. I minored in Italian there, and
Oh, yeah.
majored in English, and took a bunch of American Studies and interdisciplinary honors classes, and got really interested in manuscripts there. When I was an undergrad, I had a visiting professor from France who was teaching a class on the British modern writers, and UT Austin has this amazing humanities archive. And he took us into the manuscript libraries to have us look at the typescripts and edited manuscripts from famous novels that we were studying, like James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited. And I remember really understanding something about books by looking at the process of their being written. And so that was really formative, because now I'm doing much more archive-oriented work than I used to. And Oklahoma Humanities actually helped to jumpstart my archive project that I'm working on now, because I applied for a grant to go to DC and work in the Library of Congress manuscript collection with the help of the humanities.
Okay. And for your like general interest in the languages, do you have an idea of sort of where that came from? Or has that always been something?
Oh yeah, no, my grandparents were immigrants. And so
Okay.
I grew up listening to, they didn't actually speak Italian. They spoke this weird independent sub-language on the Italian peninsula. And so I grew up hearing other languages. And then in high school, and actually in junior high, I started taking French. And I was always just drawn to other modes of thinking and expressing, and always took languages as my electives. And so when I started college, I had enough French credits to not need a language. So I went ahead and started Italian, because I'd been listening to it. It came pretty quickly. And I wanted to study other languages. And I started taking linguistics. I wanted to take Serbo-Croatian, because UT Austin has a huge language program, dead languages and like tiny obscure languages. And I remember my folks wouldn't let me take all the languages I wanted to take, because they said I would never finish college if I only took languages. And so now I could be working for the UN as an interpreter if they'd let me do what I wanted, but I actually don't know that I would want to do interpreting, but I do love thinking about other ways of seeing the world through language.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, so you said you went to, well, actually first, are there any like experiences that you had during your time in like undergraduate college that I don't know, you would consider formative to your current work or anything like that?
I think mostly the American Studies classes I talked about, they introduced me to certain ideas. Like, I guess I didn't take American culture seriously when I was young. I think we're taught to kind of revere the European cultures, and I did, because my family my grandparents, had come over right before World War II. So we still have relatives there. We traveled there. And I thought, I idealized it and thought I would move there. And so when I took classes that made me look at American culture in a new way, that made me think about, and I think having distance through travel made me think about my own culture in different ways. And I found that pretty fascinating. And the other thing I really loved about American Studies is the interdisciplinary nature, that you can bring in the arts and social sciences and all kinds of humanities disciplines as a way of thinking about something like culture. So now, and so that was really influential, because the work I do with literature is very culture oriented, thinking about like novels as cultural expression and what they say about the culture they were written in and circulate in. So yeah, so it's interesting. I moved from a very Europhile place to a very kind of, and I consider myself still a student of American culture. And I think, so the nice thing about doing public humanities programs is I get to dabble in the other aspects of it that I don't work with in my own research. So like doing a book talk on a book by an author that I don't personally research or don't get to use in my classes, whether it's an American author or not, or a British author, that's always, I think, one of the reasons lots of professors like to do those kinds of programs, because we get to dabble in our other intellectual interests as well.
Okay, cool. And I guess sort of a very similar question for your grad school experience. Sort of how did that shape uh, your current trajectory and your profession in the humanities?
Yeah, I think I got really interested in, well, I think two things happened. One is that um, on the academic level, I went into grad school really open-minded, knowing I wanted to do something interdisciplinary, but I actually thought I might be really interested in the British Romantic, the early Romantic poets like Wordsworth, and that got dropped really quickly. But I loved grad school. I loved every class I took. It didn't matter what it was about. I think I think that when I finally got to grad school is when I was starting to really realize that's when I connected the dots with those American Studies classes in the undergrad and realizing I could do something like that in graduate school. And then I was also started taking classes for the first time in my life in different multi-ethnic writers, mostly African American in that program. Keep in mind, this is the early 90s. So when I was at UT Austin, it was when the late 80s culture wars were going on, where there was an argument. It was like the first push to get multiculturalism in the curriculum. And there were people arguing that if you introduced writers of color, then you would have to take out famous dead white males out of the curriculum because you couldn't possibly do it all. It was a very territorial war. There was a famous professor at UT Austin who was very young at the time named Wanima Lubiano, who said, she put her job on the line. She said, if you do not institute a diversity requirement, a multicultural requirement is what they called it then, in the gen ed curriculum, I will resign, I will quit, and I will leave UT Austin. And she did. She quit over it because the administration wouldn't budge. The old guard wouldn't budge. And so I never took any classes as an undergrad that I recall that had any authors who weren't white. And so when I got to grad school and started taking classes from people like William L. Andrews, who was instrumental in like rediscovering slave narratives and African-American novels that had fallen into obscurity, it really opened my eyes. And I started to see the connections between some of the experiences of different ethnic minority groups in the United States and my own family's history as immigrants and the changing definitions of race and ethnicity surrounding them. And so that's when I started really thinking about ethnic lit as a specialty. So that's where I am now. At the same time, on the job front, as a grad student, I got my first job was not teaching. It was the grad assistant for the Office of Multicultural Affairs at KU, doing publications for them and PR stuff, copywriting. And so that helped me see sort of the public side of that kind of work. I mean, it wasn't technically public humanities, but I'm starting to think that that's where some of the kind of public facing outreach work of how do we take what we're studying and talking about in books and make it matter to our real lives all started to connect for me.
Okay. And going from there, did pursuing your doctorate change or like further develop that at all? Or is it more of a just general progression from
Sure,
there?
because you have to decide what your comprehensive exams are going to be on, and you have to decide what you're going to write your dissertation on. So yeah, I wrote my dissertation on ethnic writers, multi-ethnic writers of the 1950s. I did not want to, well, my advisor said, either you can focus on one ethnic group or you can focus on one period. And I said, well, I'd like to look at some of the conversations between groups. There was at the time a pretty influential book by a historian named Ronald Takaki, who was, I think, out of that Howard Zinn social history school of social history from the ground up. And he'd written a book called something like A Different Mirror. He had another one called From Different Shores. And I remember those were new at the time. I was in grad school, and they were really eye-opening that, you know, he was really interested in looking at the intersections between different groups in the United States and how their histories were in conversation with each other, and they shouldn't be treated in a sort of a segregated way. And so that made me really interested in looking at the ways that writers are having kind of conversations across cultural divides and through different creative media. So that's where that's how I got more and more focused in that way. Got much more immersed in sort of what's now called critical race theory. And now I'm very involved in professional organizations that focus on multi-ethnic literature.
Okay. And you said that you're currently a professor of English at Oklahoma City University?
Yes.
Yeah. Is that the first professor position that you had coming out of your schooling?
I taught at Baker in Kansas for 10 years.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, and I was assistant professor there and then promoted to associate. And then it was actually I was a visiting professor for a while and then I became permanent because I guess they liked me. And then I was, so I moved here, 10 years into my career, and I've been at Oklahoma City University for 10 years now, and now I'm full professor tenured. So I've just been at the two institutions, apart from teaching as a grad student at KU.
Okay. And sort of what have your thoughts been on the, being a professor as a profession?
Well, I've been doing it for 20 years now. So
Yeah.
I got my doctorate in 2000. So it's kind of, it's normal. I think the first few years are overwhelming. You never stop teaching in the shower, in your head, in the middle of the night. Like you're just constantly thinking about how to do it right and do it well when you're learning how to do it. And it's also overwhelming. I've always taught at small schools that have a higher teaching requirement than some large schools like OU and OSU, because they have a larger research requirement. And so it took, I have to admit that for the first few years, I wasn't sure I was going to stick with it. I felt like it was wringing me out, and I felt burnt. I had a burnout because I was teaching so much, and I teach intensely. I don't phone it in. And then also still trying to do the research that I really care about, which is what brings us to the discipline. So I think it was an on again, off again relationship at first, but now it's what I do. And I have a few friends who've left academia at kind of mid-career like I am. I guess I'm mid-career, mid to late. I don't know how long I'll teach. And I just can't imagine, they shift to other kinds of jobs outside of university. And I can't imagine those jobs. I just can't imagine me doing them. It's so natural to be teaching and doing the kind of work I'm doing.
Okay, and for the research you're doing, sort of what is the, I guess, general research topics you're doing, and what does that sort of research entail on a sort of day-to-day basis?
Well, I'm involved in, so when I moved here in 2010 and I was chair for a couple of years, I got an email. This is the backstory, and this is where Oklahoma Humanities gets involved.
Okay.
I got an email from a random person who knew somebody, and he just said, I'm writing to you because you're the chair of the English department at OCU, and Ralph Ellison's 100th birthday, his centennial is coming up, and I think OCU should take hold of that and do something with it because you're the only university in the city where he was born. He didn't have any formal connections with OCU. OCU was fairly segregated at that point when he was young. So I had already published a chapter of the book I'd written that was based on my dissertation. A chapter was on Ellison's Invisible Man. And so I was really fascinated with him already, although I hadn't really studied his life. So I spearheaded and just contacted a bunch of people that I didn't even know because I hadn't been here very long, and just said, do you all want to put together a steering committee to do something for the Ellison centennial? And so that turned into all these projects. And the first thing I ever applied for my own grant application to Oklahoma Humanities was to bring John Callahan to Oklahoma City. He is the executor of Ralph Ellison's literary estate, so that when Ellison died, all of his manuscripts were left to John Callahan to try to publish posthumously. Anything that he didn't publish, all of his papers that were going to be moved to the Library of Congress are all on, John Callahan say they were close friends. Callahan was younger than Ellison. And so I brought John Callahan here to do a talk of just remembering Ralph Ellison on his centennial. And Oklahoma Humanities gave me a little funding to do that. And we had a great talk, a little, intellectual conversation. Him telling stories about having martinis at Ellison's apartment and the process of discovering unpublished manuscripts like hidden in boxes in the apartment when his widow was cleaning it out. And so that actually turned into a friendship. And I was kind of fascinated with Ellison's wife, who I didn't know very much about. And from that event, the book that I'm working on now fell into my lap, which is the biography of Fanny Ellison, Ralph's wife. So after that bringing him here for that event, he invited me to go to the Library of Congress and sneak through the archives and see if I thought there was a book there, because he thought there was. And he said, "I'm not the one to write it, so go ahead." And so I applied to Oklahoma Humanities for a little money to pay for a flight to DC and go spend a week in the archives. And now I'm 6 years, going on 7 into that project. And I remember meeting with the archivist that first time, the main archivist who had acquired the papers for the collection. So we're talking like, I've been like reading all their love letters and medical records, like they kept everything. I have thousands of documents that I scanned. I've been back 4 times, and to other archives as well, in other locations where there are letters from them to other people like Langston Hughes and Richard Wright. And I remember that archivist telling me, "This is going to take years of your life." And I just kind of laughed. I was like, "Oh, a couple years," but it's amazing how slow the work is, because you have to like figure out how to organize and sort hundreds of documents. You have to tell somebody's life story honestly and carefully, only from what you found in their papers, right? She's not alive to tell me her side of things. And also I was not trained in grad school to do archival biographical research. That wasn't what my program was focused on. I was in at the time, a very kind of theory oriented program. And so it's been slow and amazing. And so on a daily basis, I wake up, I read some love letters, I take some notes, I try to connect dots, and then I shift gears and get ready for teaching. But I'm still plugging away at this book, and I'm hoping to finish the manuscript this year. I'm like 200 pages in, and I still have a ways to go.
All right, that sounds great.
Yeah, I'm getting ready to do a talk. I was invited to do a talk at University of Scranton this spring, but it's going to be pushed back to next spring. And I think we're going to call it like Other People's Love Letters or something, just this idea of like, you go into the archives and I remember as a student, you'd hear these stories about like, this guy was digging around in some files and he found an unknown story of Ernest Hemingway's. And I remember thinking as, an 18-year-old, like, how do you do that? I want to do that. And so I haven't done that, but I have found some really cool stuff. So I feel like I'm getting to live my literary detective fantasies.
Yeah, that's great. And so, so your first interactions with Oklahoma Humanities were as a grant recipient?
My first interactions where I was directly interacting with them were that. Yes, before that, as just a faculty member in the department, I was invited to do a couple talks for Let's Talk About It. And so I was involved in that program, but I didn't really know them very well because I was just doing talks for someone else at the university who was hosting the program. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'd say my first introduction to them was sort of indirect through Let's Talk About It. So now I have taken over that position that person retired, who helped to found Harbor Win. I guess you're probably interviewing him. He helped to establish the Let's Talk About It program years ago. And so I took over that role when he retired. And so now I host our Let's Talk About It group on campus. I think it's one of the biggest in the state and has been going for at least a couple decades.
Okay. So yeah, let's go ahead and talk about it. Could you explain to me what the Let's Talk About It program is and sort of what it entails?
Yeah, it's basically a sort of scholarly book club, and the Oklahoma Humanities provides the books for people. So the groups, as any nonprofit across the state can apply. So it's done in prisons, in public libraries, in small towns, at universities, and as long as the host there does the work of applying for the grant, they get funding, they get the books sent, people borrow the books for free. And the funding goes to paying the scholars to talk. So what makes it different from a book club is that there is someone with advanced degree in humanities coming in to do a talk about, a professional talk about the book for a general audience. And so there's this kind of added component of having almost like a miniature class, because you get a lecture and then there's prepared discussion questions and people break into groups and they talk about the book through the discussion questions. Some groups, I've done it in various places around the state. Some groups do snacks, some are small, some have 4 people, some have, mine sometimes has 50 people in it. But it's a great program I'd say that most of the people who participate are retired because they have the time to read that many books. They usually every 2, 3, 4 weeks, a new book. But we sometimes we align some of our classes with it, where students can go to the lectures for extra credit since they're happening on campus anyway. So it's a really nice way for people who are interested in not just reading a book and sitting around and drinking a glass of wine and dishing on the characters, to like get a little more out of a book group. Yeah, I think, and there's some really interesting themes and interesting sets of titles in each theme. I do think some people wish that it could be a little more free, where they could choose the book. The people could choose the book, but because the books are chosen for them. It's still, there's something to learn from any book.
Yeah. Who is it that chooses the books?
Well, Oklahoma Humanities hires I'm trying to think of, I can't remember the term they use. They hire someone to develop the themes. So I've done one, like when they got a grant from the Pulitzer Foundation for the Pulitzer Centennial, they did several themes based on Pulitzer nominated and Pulitzer Prize winning books. And so I did one on equality and civil rights, where I chose titles from the Pulitzer lists, and the scholar puts together an essay explaining why these books go together and what the theme is. And so it's almost like a curatorial role. And then you create the theme, and then it stays in circulation for a long time. We store the books for the program at Oklahoma City University in the library there. And then a guy who works for Oklahoma Humanities ships them out to the groups all over the state. So I think it's a really interesting project.
Yeah. So it sounds like that there's a lot of interaction between Oklahoma Humanities and the scholars involved in the planning process for this.
Not so much, actually. It's more indirect. Okay. Because what happens is, like, say it's at Guthrie's Public Library, the person who does their public programming will apply for the grant and arrange the scholars and set up the program for their own site. And Oklahoma Humanities just helps them. They'll give them a list of, here are the scholars who are current, here's the funding, here's how the program should operate, here's how you need to publicize it. And so they help, but really it's the on-site person who sets it up for each location. Because if you think about it, they're going on all over the state. One person at Humanities can't do all that.
Right, so they play more of a enabling role for everyone else to do it. Okay. And I don't know, sort of, what do you think about how Oklahoma Humanities has been working with the Let's Talk About It program?
I think it's great. I mean, it's rolling, and it seems like they have done a good job of pivoting to some online groups during the pandemic. We haven't taken ours online just because it's so, for a long time, it was such a big group. And because I ask a lot of people at OCU to do presentations, and you have to do the grant application several months out, when we were in the middle of figuring out how to teach under these circumstances last October, I didn't really feel like I could ask anybody to commit to January 2021.
Yeah.
So I admire the fact that, and they've been great. Like Oklahoma Humanities, the people I talked to, they're like, if you want to do it, we'll help you figure out how to do it online. We'll support that. But if you decide to, take a break from it, we're fine with that too. Like they really just want people to be safe, and they want people to engage how they're most comfortable. So, and I know they've been making a big push to get the program in prisons more. And I think I'm hearing really good things about that. I mean, the lack of enrichment programs in the state prisons is pretty astounding. And so I think the people who participate in those programs really, really appreciate them. We also have one at Women's First Step, which is a reentry program for women who've just been released from incarceration, and sort of a halfway house kind of situation. And they have the book group there, and they love it. They read things that connect to their lives and creates meaning for something, to use their minds when they weren't able to do that kind of programming in prison. So. And it's interesting, I'd meet people who would be like, yeah, I wanted to be a writer when I was in high school, and then this happened. And so now I really want to read more and write more. And it's interesting who you meet in those programs. So yeah, I like the way they're trying to make it really accessible to lots of people. They're probably going to have to change some of the reading lists though. I think some of the choices are sort of academic, and I say that having curated the theme that was the one on civil rights and equality. A lot of those books are really tough reads, and not every group is going to like them. And so I think they might have to develop some new themes as they make that program more and more accessible. But I'll be curious to see what they do with it. I think they're only developing one theme a year now, which is reasonable. Books, getting a lot of books costs a lot of money. Books get damaged, books get lost. They have to constantly replace them. So, but no, I think they're really responsive to input, and yeah, I like the way they handle it. I like that they let each local group kind of do what they want with it, even though there's guidelines. Everyone's got their own little flavor. So, like I did one in Watauga, and I can't believe I committed to do that in the winter. I remember it got snowed out and we had to delay it. It was years ago. And I drove all the way out to Watauga, and it was a group of like 6 women, and they did potluck that was thematically related to the book every time. And so I happened to be talking about a book about a woman traveling in China called The Last Chinese Chef or something like that. And so they all brought Asian food, and it was like a potluck dinner, and everybody just sat around and ate and talked about the book. And it was sweet. Like everyone has their own culture. And I think Oklahoma Humanities kind of promotes that kind of community building through books.
Yeah, that sounds great. So beyond the Let's Talk About It program and the other grants that you've mentioned, have you had any other interactions or experiences with Oklahoma Humanities?
Yes, lots. Let's see. I feel like they're my cousins now. I have been involved in a couple of different oral history grant-based projects I wasn't the primary project director on them, but I've been involved in 2 oral history projects that Oklahoma Humanities funded and supported. One was related to the Ralph Ellison Centennial. We did a program called Remembering Ralph, where we interviewed people who'd known him or met him because there were still people around that had connections to his generation in Oklahoma City, or people who grew up with their parents being friends with him. So we did interviews with those people and housed them. It was a partnership with the History Center. So those are housed at the History Center. And then about a year and a half ago, I was involved in a project with Black Space Oklahoma, who got a grant from Oklahoma Humanities to do this placemaking project for the Northeast side. And they did a series of workshops and lectures and some oral history projects. And so I was hired as the oral historian on that project to come in and do some interviews with community members about memories of the Northeast side before, during, and after gentrification, or what they called urban renewal at the time. And also trained some of the community members on how to do oral history interviews with one another so that they could keep the project going. And I do believe it is still going. Like the grant from Oklahoma Humanities got it going, and then it was going to move to the Metro Public Library System, wanted to take it on in their archive and digitize it and continue doing interviews over at the Ralph Ellison branch of the public library. So I know the pandemic has slowed that down, but I think the project will keep going because Black Space is doing great work. So I hope so. I hope it keeps going. There's some good stories in the elders in this community. So I'm trying to think what else I've done. So that was kind of me being a hired hand on a couple of projects they funded. I've presented at two of the Curiosity festivals. I think there've only been two. I presented at the Curiosity Fests, which I think is a really cool kind of way to do something fun and public and get more young people involved in public humanities. Yeah, I try to go to as many programs and support them as much as I can, but those are ones I've been directly involved with.
Okay. Could you explain what the Curiosity Festival sort of is?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what year it started. Well, they launched one, and I'm sure the pandemic has put a damper on that. I'm trying to think what year it started. They can tell you. Are you going to be interviewing them?
I don't know, maybe.
I can be. It was basically like a fun way to do like sort of a festival of ideas. You hear about like the Aspen Ideas Festival or whatever. Maybe it was 2018 or 2017 that they did it. They did it for the first time here. And it's basically like, you know, you could apply to do a talk about a book that you wrote. You could there was a competitive sort of mini TED Talk thing where it was like a competition throwdown on who could do the most interesting humanities lecture in 15 minutes, and then the audience would vote. The first year they brought in Jad Abumrad from Radiolab to do the keynote. They had a guy talking about the Equal Justice Initiative, Ben Bates, who's on the board, did a session on trying to just get people together to think about how Oklahoma could commemorate its lynching victims as the EJI goes national. So it was just a really cool, there was a band, we did a story slam. There was just all kinds of really interesting. It was sort of like there were multiple rooms and you could choose which one you wanted to go to. So you could go to different sessions. I did one year where they were teaching how to do a Cherokee game. I can't remember what the game was. It involved balls. It looked like bocce ball. But like we learned all the Cherokee language for the game, and then we learned how to play the game. So it was just, it was a language preservation and cultural preservation kind of activity. So they're really fun. You have all these people that you've never met before from all over the city, just like exploring ideas and history. And they did a live podcast at one I think it was about Game of Thrones or something. There's all kinds of fun stuff. So I hope they start doing them again after things become sort of normal.
Yeah, it sounds like a great time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And let's see. Going back to sort of the grants that you've received from Oklahoma Humanities, I guess sort of how would you say that those have impacted your ability to, either do your research or perform these public humanities initiatives?
Well, I'd say, for those kinds of things like research or, I mean, really it's about the funding. I mean, funding and promotion. They provide funds where there aren't funds or supplemental funds where you don't have enough. And they really help promote it through their different promotional outlets like social media and their website. Um, I think that some of the programs we've done probably wouldn't reach as many people without their help, and maybe wouldn't have, like the one where I was hired to help do the oral histories for Black Space. I mean, Black Space probably couldn't have pulled off a lot of what they wanted to without that funding, that seed money. And they do matching funds for, when you want to try to cobble together different funding resources. So I think in some ways they've made things possible or more expansive. I've applied for a couple grants from them to help support our annual poetry efforts on campus, and it doesn't pay for all of it when we bring in these poets to do a couple days of workshops and lectures and readings, and that costs. And so having this supplement and having sort of a partnership with multiple organizations around the city really helps to expand the outreach and the audience for those kinds of it's public money, and you want to reach more of the public. And at a university, one of the challenges is, and I don't know if you feel this way, but I've always felt like when I was growing up, my parents always kind of zeroed in on universities as a place where culture was happening, symphony concerts or whatever. But also, they have their own culture, and it's hard to navigate a campus if you don't know the campus, right? If you were to just be plopped down into the middle of OU and try to find something without knowing all those buildings and knowing how to navigate the campus, it can be intimidating. And so having somebody off campus as a partner to help you expand the outreach and get people to your programs on campus, it maybe makes it seem like a little less of a fortress. So I think that helps.
Yeah. And so if you know the numbers, sort of how long have you had a relationship with Oklahoma Humanities at this point?
I'd say about 8 years. I would say 2013 is when I applied for that first grant to get John Callahan here for the Ellison Centennial. Okay. And then that actually exploded into a symposium, so I applied for more funding. So they're very supportive of all of my cockamamie ideas, but apparently I'm accurate in my paperwork, which is why they're nice to me. But yeah, I'd say about 8 years. Yeah, and I mean, there's been some turnover in the staff, so I don't know some of the new people very well. But I really have a great working relationship with many of the people. I think they have a great staff, a really good team. I'm really envious of their new offices. They're not that new anymore, but their offices are beautiful. I was tempted to apply for a job there just so I could work in that office because it's so. No, I think they're really, they've done some things in the past few years since I've known them in the past 8 years. They've, kind of done some rebranding, some rethinking about how to do programming and how to reach more people that I think is really exciting. And I hope that the pandemic doesn't impede that work. I think some of the federal money that they got to help cultural organizations maybe is going to increase their visibility because they had funding to help other small groups get through. So I'm hoping that will actually build Oklahoma Humanities more people will become aware of it. I think there's always the challenge of like young people not knowing what the word humanities means or understanding what public humanities is, even if they're people who like to read, like history or whatever. So there's that constant challenge of how do you get younger audiences involved in the humanities. And I think that Oklahoma Humanities has had some good creative approaches to that. some events that were focused specifically on that. Even if they were just kind of pilots that they were trying out, I think it's great that they're experimenting, because I think, from what I understand, some state humanities agencies are stereotypically stodgy. Like, my experience of them before moving here was that, they would put on chautauquas where they'd have, like, some person dressed as a pioneer talking about what life was like in a sod house. And, there's only so many times you want to see that, right? Or there's only a certain audience for that after a while. And so I think Oklahoma Humanities is really trying to break out of that stereotype. At least in this region, it's all like a friend of mine who works for the State Humanities Council in Kansas is like, I don't know how much more Dust Bowl stuff I can get interested in, right? Same with Oklahoma. There's a lot of Dust Bowl stuff, and it's important and it's interesting, but it's more than that. Like, if the humanities programming has to go beyond, like, memories of the Dust Bowl or something.
Yeah. Yeah. So the rebranding you were mentioning earlier is sort of this initiative to expand, reach new audiences with new ideas.
Yeah, and I think the Curiosity Fest was part of that, and there've been a couple other big public events that they've really, really gotten publicity behind in the city, like when they brought Bernstein from Woodward and Bernstein to talk about Nixon and politics, and it was a big event. It was like, you had to compete to get a ticket to go to it, even though it was a free event. It was very well attended. I think they've tried to do some other events that involve, like, I'm trying to remember if they partnered with public radio for, like, election coverage during the midterm elections. But it seems like they've been trying to do some things about politics. Their magazine has very much, I think the magazine they publish has gone way up in quality to where they're bringing in more national writers, and it has a broader kind of interest, and it's a really nice magazine. Before, I think it was sort of just for locals who were interested in that kind of thing already. So I just think they're making a lot of really good moves.
Okay. Yeah, so we're getting pretty close to an hour now. So I think we could sort of just start wrapping up by, if there's anything else that you want to share or say about either Oklahoma Humanities as an organization or just the humanities in general, feel free to share.
Well, I guess one thing I've been thinking about in the past few years is that there's a national conversation about the importance of public humanities. I think there was, for a long time, a sort of separation between professors and the public. And I think in the 90s, lots of people started talking about ways in which what they teach and what they research has to have some sort of social relevance. And I think that I'm seeing more and more conversations in national organizations about public humanities, and that what we do for a living, studying books, may seem like this really specialized and unimportant thing. And we realize that so much of what we do as a society is informed by the humanities. So, for example, when not to bring up politics, but when January 6th happened and the attack on the Capitol, I remember somebody posting on Twitter, if only we'd had historical or book, not any idea from books that something like this could possibly happen, and it was like, yeah, that's why the humanities is necessary, because somebody imagined something like that happening and thought about the implications of it. So it really does matter. And so I think I'm seeing a lot more partnership between academics and public humanities agencies, and I love that partnership, and I think it's how we make our academic work matter more in the public sphere. And so I'm grateful for these agencies, and I hope they stay around for a long time. I don't even know how long the one in Oklahoma has been in existence. I bet that'll come out in the histories.
I think this like version, I guess, of the organization is coming up on their 50th anniversary.
Yeah, I guess you did say that. That's why.
Yeah. I think that I don't exactly recall. I think that there was like
70s, yeah.
a slightly different like take on it that existed for a few years before that they had to like restructure because it didn't work very effectively.
Right.
But yeah, this project's for the 50th anniversary of Oklahoma Humanities.
I forgot
So
that.
it's been around for a while.
Yeah, so maybe like as long as I've been alive, that's kind of fun. That I've come of age with Oklahoma Humanities without even knowing it.
Yeah, the hidden connections.
Yes. And it will matter to me for many years to come. So I just hope they don't die when I die. I hope they live longer than that.
Yeah. Well, if you have, nothing else on your mind right now,
I think, the whole idea of the relevance of public humanities and academic partnerships is probably where I'll land it. Yeah, I don't want to get into politics, but we have to keep advocating for this kind of thing, and we should keep advocating for it. I'm happy to have like a tiny percentage of my tax dollars go to this kind of thing, versus, I don't know, nuclear warheads. I don't know. I guess it's all necessary, so why not let us have a part of it in the humanities?
Yeah, sounds like a good place to wind up.
Well, thanks. It's been fun talking about it.
Yeah, I've enjoyed this as well.